Hey everybody, Steve Jones. This is the CardsHQ Podcast from the Courier-Journal and Courier-Journal.com. Typically, my colleague and friend Jeff Greer is the MC of our podcast, but Jeff has deferred to me as we're going to focus mostly on spring football and the upcoming spring game for Louisville coming up this week. But we will have a guest appearance by Jeff here in just a second to talk about the news that occurred with Louisville today with Mott Stockman's transfer. Gentry Estes, our sports planning editor, is also here. Hello, Gentry.
Hi, good to be on.
Gentry is a former beat writer, covered Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee, various newspapers and websites across the South, and has also been out and seen Louisville football and Louisville Pro Day and stuff like that. So we'll get his thoughts on the spring football too. So first off, we will talk a little bit about whatever the basketball news today was. Jeff, welcome into the podcast. You are now the guest for the first time ever on the podcast. How's that feel?
Yeah, it's a little weird to be like calling in versus sitting here holding a little microphone up to a phone or something like that.
Yeah, well, we just cannot go without hearing your insights on all things Louisville basketball. So tell us today, just first of all, just tell us what happened today with Stockman, if you were surprised at all by that, if that seemed to be something you were expecting, and already that it already seems to have resolved itself as far as where he's headed.
Yeah, well, it's funny that somebody, I go back to the day after the national championship game, and I posted, these fun ACC power rankings, just thinking it'd be just kind of a fun way to start the off season. And somebody said, it's baseball season. Why are you writing about basketball? Leave it alone and move on. It's basketball season's over. Which one was shocking to hear from a Louisville fan, but two, basketball season in this market never ends, as we are learning. And today's news definitely proves that. I would just say, I did hear about it, heard rumors about it, and that's all they were whenever I talked to anyone. And, it's always frustrating as a reporter, as you guys both know, that when you hear about something and it could be true, but you can't confirm it with people who would know, and then it's announced. Obviously you'd rather it be announced by the school than by another media outlet. But no, it wasn't all that surprising to me. There was no playing time for Matt's coming back. He was actually, Rick Pitino was talking a lot about maybe redshirting him next year and bringing him back for the 2018-19 season and using him then. But even then, I just don't know where the minutes would come from. I just have always looked at him, and Steve, you know from following the recruiting trail as much as you used to, that there are certain guys that you can just kind of pick out of the lot that you say, oh, this guy will fit in really well with Duke or with Louisville or Kentucky or, North Carolina. And Knotts is just not someone that I would see ever really clicking with Louisville's style of play or finding minutes, considering the recruiting classes that they've already brought in. Ray Spalding presumably will come back for his senior year unless he takes off in some otherworldly way as a junior. And then Malik Williams probably seems like a guy who would be at Louisville for a couple of years. Lance Thomas will be there. And they're also recruiting guys in the 2018 class who are big men. So it was hard for me to ever see Mott's getting any playing time. So it just seemed like a logical departure for him to move on.
Jeff, I know you definitely think Jalen Johnson's going to be coming back anyway, but is this pretty much confirmation of that?
I'm not really. I would just say, it's just a sign that he realizes, the writing is on the wall with Malik Williams coming in. And, Jalen, I think they always thought he was coming back. So I don't know if it would be confirmation, just kind of just continuing that thought of, look, he's going to be back. Ray Spalding's going to be back. Honest Mahmoud's back. Malik Williams is back. Lance Thomas and Jordan Nwora can both play power forward. So that, if Louisville wanted to go smaller in their lineup and move Ray Spalding or even Jalen Johnson to the 5 and be, smaller but a little bit more physical than any of their 5 men. All of those options sound better than playing Mott Stockman. So, like, I'm not trying to bash the kid, but I just, he has a soft touch. He can score around the basket. He's a reasonably good rebounder for a 7-footer, and his teammates all say, that he's, a beast in practice, but it hasn't translated to the court, and he's already been in the program for 3 years. So it's just, to me, at some point you just kind of cut ties with a project that isn't working out.
Well, I always remember hearing Rick bring up, I guess fairly late in the season, maybe even as the tournament was approaching, about Mott's redshirting next year, and I was like, huh, what? They're gonna, and if he's gonna sit out next year, he might as well do it somewhere else, right? And that where he's gonna eventually get a chance to play. So has he already committed to Minnesota? Is that correct?
Yes, he is transferring to Minnesota, and that's where the frustration comes in for me. Is the rumor was that he was in Minnesota this weekend, that he was spotted looking at Minnesota this weekend. And so, it's kind of funny, obviously, the Richard and Rick connection. You wonder if Minnesota will send them like a commit from the 2020 class or something in exchange for Matt Stockman, or like,
a 3-star recruit to be named later.
Yeah, something like that. They get 2 scholarships in exchange for a transfer. Who knows? But yeah, that was the rumor. There were a couple other schools that I had heard may be interested in him, but that they were considered fallback options if Minnesota didn't work out. And I'm guessing the Norwegian and Twin Cities environments and atmospheres and climate
the Viking culture of Minnesota is appealing to him.
That does sound about right.
Exactly right.
I think that I always have found from my days covering recruiting that the Richard and Rick sort of dynamic of recruiting similar players and stuff was always interesting, because they seem to just have some sort of agreement that they won't really step on each other's toes very much, and that they will, if one of them doesn't get the guy, maybe they'll recommend him go to play for the other guy. And I always remember that when Quinn Snyder first decommitted, Minnesota was like the first school to offer him, and I always thought that was interesting. But he probably, I would say, is good enough to get a little run at Minnesota. But he did help him.
Do you remember, Steve? I think you were still doing recruiting when Bakary Konate was
exactly. He was the other one I was
coming
thinking
through.
Of. Yeah.
Yeah, and Louisville, he wasn't good enough to play at Louisville, so they were like, "You should go to Minnesota." And he hasn't panned out there. It's not like I'm not going to sit here and say Minnesota gets Louisville scraps, because it's not like Louisville is, they have a top 10 class coming in, but they're not Kansas, Kentucky, Duke, teams like that as far as recruiting goes. But, Minnesota, it does seem like, okay, if Louisville passes on them, then you're right. It seems like Minnesota is the next, is a possibility for a kid that Louisville is looking at.
So the one other thing, Jeff, I guess, is that this frees up maybe a scholarship that they weren't going to have. Are you aware? Can you think of what would be maybe a priority they would have as either a late transfer or a recruit that may still be available, or a JUCO or something like that? That they may do with this. I think that a lot of people have thought about what would happen if Mitchell goes pro, and that would obviously free up a spot too. Now they have that spot whether Mitchell goes pro or not.
Right. Well, there are a few names that have surfaced. I know. Here's the thing that makes recruiting so interesting, and in football it's the same way, although there's so many more bodies involved in football that it's a little different. But teams are always trying to map out 4, 6, 8 years in advance as far as they can go and project what their roster looks like. And so Louisville has done significant legwork on Lewis King, on Moses Brown, on Emmett Williams, on a bunch of 2018 big guys. Apparently David McCormack at Oak Hill is planning to come visit Louisville. So they've recruited a bunch of kids, and I'm surely leaving a few guys off. Silvio D'Souza. There's a bunch of kids in the 2018 class, big guys that they like. They brought in 3 guys. Nora and Lance Thomas are both like 3-4 combos. They both are such good shooters that it seems like they prefer to be swingmen versus a true 4, but they could play sort of a stretch 4 type role. And then Malik Williams obviously is their prized recruit in this class. So when you think of all of those different things, you wonder, okay, well, do they want to add a wing? Or how do they want to do this? But all indications are that they will either that they are contemplating a couple transfers who are big guys. The one name that seems the most logical, and this is just me speculating, I don't have any solid information, is Juwan Durham, who was a kid out of Tampa who U of L recruited pretty closely for a long time. And I believe he was on Jordan Fair's AAU team, I believe, a team breakdown on the Under Armour circuit. And he went to UConn, but I believe he considered Louisville. I know that he considered Louisville. Now Jordan Fair is now an assistant. So he is transferring from UConn. I believe he has 3 more years of eligibility, so he would sit out a year and then have 3 years left. He's had some knee injuries, but that's a name that you might want to pay attention to over these next couple of weeks, as he is obviously going to be highly recruited. He was a top 60 recruit in his class. So that's a guy to pay attention to. But it sounds like they'll, if something comes up, they'll fill it, but they're not in any great rush to fill it necessarily this year.
Yeah, the one thing that about Juwan Durham that I remember was he was at the Under Armour camp playing with Team Breakdown, same team as Dwan Huell, and then I didn't know Jordan Fair's name back then, so I don't know how much he was associated with him. But they did watch, the whole staff watched that guy's game. He was awesome. I remember him being interested in Louisville when I talked to him afterward. And that was the same weekend. They were really hot and heavy on Donovan Mitchell too. So that was I would think that would that would seem like a logical or realistic or plausible scenario that they could get him, because I do think he was interested in them, as well as Dwan Huell going into his senior year of high school. So anyway,
yeah,
Jeff,
that's a pretty good front court.
yeah, that would be good. All right, Jeff. Well, thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it. You got the Derby Classic game coming up with a lot of those signees that you mentioned this week, and we'll have a lot of coverage of that. And Jeff, as always, thanks a lot. And I will attempt, Gentry and I will attempt to not ruin your reputation on the CardsHQ podcast here in your absence for the next 20 minutes.
All right, have fun, guys.
All right, see you, dude. All right, well, thanks to Jeff for joining in for a little of the basketball breaking news that occurred. Gentry, any thoughts on the Matt Stockman era of Louisville basketball?
You sit down to talk some football, and it's you still got to talk about basketball.
Right?
So I didn't know Matt Stockman very well. I didn't see him play very much, but I think given Louisville's situation, the scholarship will probably go to good use.
Yeah, right, yeah. That will probably be the most notable thing about the Mont Stockman era, was that he freed up a scholarship for someone else. But I could understand that the people were very excited when they got him, because he's just so tall and was such a unknown. But seemed like a good kid, and he'll probably do well at Minnesota.
Well, you do those. You take those project guys, and I think you can make a case that Mahmoud worked out. Really, to see what happened with him. So if you got 500 with that, that's pretty good.
Right. All right, well, let's talk. Let's shift gears to football. I have the spring football game coming up Saturday at 1:00 at Papa John's, and people always are interested to see what the attendance and things will be like. If you're coming out to the stadium for the first time, and since last year, you will be probably pretty surprised to see the amount of construction work they have done.
I'm a little surprised they're playing it there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's still totally usable. It's just, and especially probably from a fan perspective, because I don't know that any of that, the concourses or the seating or anything is obstructed or anything like that. But you'll just notice that anybody that's been coming to Louisville games for years, that entire green grassy knoll between the end zone and the football complex is dirt and bulldozers and cranes and they're laying the foundation down for that seating structure, which I think they're going to have done by next year. And the other thing is that the big scoreboard isn't there. I've had people ask me if they're going to have a scoreboard this year for the season. I'm not sure about that, and it definitely will change and reaccommodate. People need to be reaccommodated, to use United Airlines parlance, if it doesn't have that. So, because right now there's not one, so it'll be interesting. There's still the one over the crunch zone, but if you're sitting in the crunch zone, you can't see that one.
Yeah, that actually affects games. I mean, if you're going one direction, the quarterback can't see you.
I'll try. It's an interesting. I don't know how they'll do it. Maybe they'll always play it to the same side in this, scripted game that they have. I don't know how they'll do that, but yeah, it's interesting to see what they're going to do exactly. I'll probably should find out what they're going to do with the scoreboard.
Play clock or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So anyway, beyond that, expect it to be a huge difference as you view it. I mean, the place looks completely different. It's a major construction site right now. Anyway, on to the actual game. So typically the way they do it, we haven't heard Bobby Petrino say what the format's going to be. Typically it does one offense versus two defense, two offense versus one defense, and it leads to the some of the blowout scores that we've come to know, which I think was 73-7 or something last year. So we would expect Lamar Jackson to have tons of stats. We would expect the defense, if that's how they do it. Now maybe they'll change it up, but probably won't. That seems to be how Bobby likes to do it. And I don't know how much necessarily we can glean from it, but the things that I'll be looking for, obviously, will be just that to see what the personnel is, who runs out with the first team, and sort of the personnel and the lineups of the defense, new under Peter Sirmon. Gentry, do you have any observations from when you went out to practice there last week?
Yeah, first of all, I always love spring games because that is the ultimate test of your glass half empty versus half full fan.
Yeah.
Because if you're a negative fan, you're going to walk away from every spring game with stuff to worry about. And if you're not, then you're going to love what you see. Because no matter what good happens, if the offense struggles, then the offense is terrible and the defense is great. If what happened last year with Lamar getting about 13 touchdowns in the spring game last year, it's like, well, the defense is terrible and the offense is great. So no matter what, you're going to see good and bad in this. Personally, I think it's going to be Lamar doing that again. From what I saw being out there were a lot of DBs with their hands raised looking at the coach, not knowing what the call was. And I think some of that is natural when you have a new defensive coordinator. I don't think their scheme is that different from what they had under Todd Grantham, but I think their terminology is. And I don't think everybody was getting the calls the way they should, at least the day I was out there. And Steve, you may have seen different. But that day there was an angry Peter Sirmon saying a lot about guys not getting the call in the secondary and not a lot of guys being covered when they didn't. So I think you're going to see a lot of wide open receivers, a lot of points. Good day for Lamar. He probably won't play much after the halftime. I am a little interested to see how the offensive line fares, especially running the ball. I don't think from what I've seen when they scrimmage in practice, it's not full go. They're not tackling to the ground, and it's not the kind of thing where you're really being able to see what the offensive line and the defense can do in a full game setting. This will be that, so I think it will be interesting to see what kind of push the offensive line gets against a fairly formidable defensive front, I think. They're pretty deep up there.
Assuming that they do 1 versus 2, which you may not see that, So
you're right.
That was one. That's the one, I guess, caveat of the spring game is that, it's off limits to hit the quarterback, so he's not really going to be under pressure. I don't know if they whistle those plays dead, if they actually had, for all intents and purposes, a sack on him, or if they'll, let him bounce off and throw a ball anyway. But that was one thing that I think they looked good last year in the spring game. Was that they did give him a huge pocket, which is why he was able to just get all this time and then throw just 50-yard touchdown, 60-yard touchdown, 50-yard touchdown.
As it turns out, this was actually a fair preview of the season at the time. We didn't realize at the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember I wrote the Charlotte game story I wrote. I was like, people are making this like he scored 7 touchdowns at halftime against Charlotte, or 8. And I was like, that's pretty much what he did in the spring game. Louisville's second-team defense is about as good as Charlotte's.
Guys are trying. It wasn't like he's
Louisville's second-team defense is about as good as Charlotte's first-team defense, and that was kind of how it played out. So you would think, I mean, aside from Lamar throwing like 4 picks and just looking very bad, which I've never seen Lamar Jackson look that way. Probably will come away from the spring game feeling pretty confident.
I think you usually want your offense to do better at this time of year. It's usually a better sign, especially when you have a new coach on the other side of the ball. But I think, the offense should have a better handle on what they're doing right now than the defense should on stopping them. So I think it's usually a healthy sign for a team if the offense has a good spring game.
Yeah. So one thing that would be interesting would be to see who plays running back. The last scrimmage, which was closed to the media, was all just sort of according to Bobby Petrino. Reggie Bonifant had been moved back to running back, at least for that day. I don't know that it was any kind of permanent move, but
they need to involve him more.
Yeah,
they really do. He is a good football player.
Yeah, Petrino has said it, that they feel like they didn't get him enough touches last year. He is their most. I mean, if you did play him at running back, he would be their most athletic, fastest running back. But I think he's a good receiver. I mean, right now he was playing slot receiver last year, and it was his first year as a full-time college receiver. So I think you can give him some level of a learning curve there. He's been playing outside this spring. So they have Seth Dawkins, who's had a great spring, I think by all accounts, at least during the scrimmages. We haven't got to watch the scrimmages, but Seth Dawkins is now playing Jamari Staples' spot. Bonifant is playing Quick's spot on the outside. Now, Jalen Smith is hurt, so he's not playing. So he's sort of the X factor here. But then they're moving Samuel. They've moved Samuel inside and is playing the slot where Bonifant played last year. So, the practice you're referring to, Gentry, two open practices ago, Bonifant was great. He caught tons of balls. That was playing on the outside, and he looked like just a guy who's open more, who's running the right routes, who's tougher to cover. Maybe that's just all just sort of going back to the experience of getting to play. Then we hear this last scrimmage that he's playing running back primarily. So they definitely seem like they want to get him the ball.
He just doesn't seem what they want at running back. Petrino seems to just want a hoss, a big guy that he can run between the tackles.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I think that they had Radcliffe there 2 years ago, which would have been Lamar's first year. Radcliffe was being like, okay, I am going to become a Petrino-style power running back, and he bulked up to about 225 pounds, and then they immediately become a read option Lamar Jackson running team, and Radcliffe was not a good fit for that. They needed a more explosive kind of guy to be next to Lamar. Then last year, Radcliffe went down to like 210 and was a great fit. He really was a great fit in that role. This year, with Radcliffe gone, they don't have a quick, explosive guy like that for that option. And this spring, they've practiced really extensively in more of the Petrino 1.0, well, not one, what first era Petrino power running game, which is coming out of the eye, using a fullback, Lamar under center, and dropping back, handing it off. I don't know if it gets to the fourth quarter against Clemson, if they're not going to just have Lamar run 8 times in a row out of the option, because that's probably what I would do.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, they have been trying Jeremy Smith and Dave Williams. And but the thing is, I think both those guys are hurt right now. Jeremy Smith is hurt. He has, from my understanding, Bobby has not exactly announced what he's got. My understanding is it's a kind of several weeks kind of injury that probably keep him out for the rest of spring. Dave Williams was, I guess, not at the last scrimmage. I don't know what the extent of his injury is, if he has one or why he was
what? The practice I saw, I liked him. He was an impressive.
Yeah, he's huge. He's a huge guy. and moves better than I thought. He told me I think he ran a 4.6 too, which isn't great, but isn't bad.
He had some good wiggle to him to be as big as he was. I thought he moved pretty well.
Yeah, no, he is definitely hearkening back to the Eric Shelton, Michael Bush, Anthony Allen sort of body type of Louisville running backs, more so than we've seen with for instance Radcliffe. But in the meantime, they may need Bonifant to play running back just because they don't have very many. Malik Williams is another guy that'll be in the mix this fall, and Colin Wilson, the 4-star recruit, will be in the mix this fall. But neither of those guys are available this game.
Well, and this is something I'd want to see is that it sounds like they're not going to have the bodies to really do the pro-style run game in the spring game, really, unless you have your Bonifant back there. But it is interesting that Petrino is kind of trying to go more traditional pro-style, whatever you want to call it, with this offense. And it's been so successful the other way. So it's almost like, do you mess with that? I mean, you won a Heisman Trophy last year with this guy.
Yeah.
I think if you just find 5 offensive linemen that can block a little better, you're probably good. Probably don't need to overhaul that.
Right. No, I think you're right. I guess what you find, though, is that they have switched offensive line coaches and co-OCs. Klanakis was a pistol guy. Going back to his Nevada days, his Kaepernick days, Summers is a Bobby Petrino power running guy from his first time at Louisville. I think that Florida's been running lots of spread, I guess, though, right? Or have they? I don't even know.
McElwain will do the pistol and some of this stuff.
Yeah, so, I mean, he's obviously ultimately it's Petrino's playbook. It's not like they're going to change things around too much because of Mike Summers, but that could be a reason why they decided that they want to reemphasize that this fall or this spring.
Although McElwain is an interesting addition for the new coach, I will say, because that's a guy who is a pretty varied background. I did cover him at Alabama for a year, and he has been with Saban, and he has some background with Fresno State, and then in the NFL for 1 year. So that I never thought about that. But Summers working 1 year under Jim McElwain, or working under Jim McElwain at Florida, is an interesting addition to a guy who is already considered a very good offensive coach.
Yeah. Well, I'd covered Summers some when he was at UK, and I think that everybody just thought he was brilliant. And I think everybody at U of L from his first tenure thought he was brilliant. Just as a technician, a guy who related to the guys, they just seemed to listen and learn from him really well. When you watch practice, I mean, you can't tell any of that stuff. I mean, they look like they're just doing all the same drills pretty much, but I mean, the proof's in the pudding with some of the guys he put in the league from Bobby's first time with Eric Wood and Quarterman and some of those guys that they had. So anyway,
that to me is still the big question on this team is obviously that part of it, and it's amazing how successful they were on offense last season, especially at quarterback, obviously, despite having a lot of issues up front that were never solved from the year before. And I think defensively, I think it may not go well Saturday. I wouldn't read too much into that. I think there's a lot they're going to have going on. But watch the offensive line. I think really that Steve wrote a story yesterday, a good story about 2 kids from St. X who are competing for playing time up front. If you're looking for non-scholarship guys in your starting 5, it's not a good sign, folks.
Yeah.
I mean, they might be good players, and that's nothing against the 2 of them, but that's usually not what you want. So to me, that's a little bit of a red flag. Just see how this goes on Saturday with those guys up front. I think that's a big question.
No, I mean, okay, so if you look at specifically at the spots they have open, so Tobiah Hughley obviously was a guy who worked really hard. He was a guy who knew the offense, who knew the calls, and seemed to, no matter who, all comers, he was able to win that job every year. But I think the bottom line is that he was not a guy that will go down in history as one of the greatest players ever at Louisville. And you would hope that you could have an upgrade there. But, as it is, as we're talking about, they're considering 2 walk-ons and a redshirt freshman who was a low 3-star recruit. Again, guys that could be really good in the long run. But I think that's a concern.
I'll say this: 2 of the best centers I've ever covered if they walk down the street, you would not think they were football players.
Yeah.
And one of them now starts for the New England Patriots.
Yeah.
And was a 2-star recruit. Just saying, center's maybe a little different spot than the other ones.
That's true. I think Eric Wood was a guy who was not a highly recruited guy. Louisville's never gotten any. They've never gotten any highly recruited offensive linemen, with a few exceptions, until this year. And that's why that's a bit of an X factor, is thinking about who will come in and compete this year. I think I'd have to go back and remember what I wrote on signing day, but I think they had 1 or 2 4-star recruits like in the history of like stars, like since internet websites have been around. They've had 2 or 3 4-star offensive linemen, and this year they signed 5. So just as far as if you want to base it on quality of offers, size, and star rankings, then there's going to be a huge surge of talent coming in. One guy, notably, is Ronald Rudd, who's a JUCO, who should be positioned physically well enough to play, to compete to play right away. Cole Bentley is a guard who is already enrolled. He seems to be a little bit lost, understandably, and is on the second-team offense. So I don't know that he'll be ready to play either. But what they've done is they have moved Lucaeus McNeil in from tackle to guard, which is where he played 2 years ago. So you got Christian and McNeil on one side, and that's probably good. I mean, those guys are both good. They both played a lot. They both will be NFL prospects. Linwood Foy was a lightly recruited JUCO transfer last year. A good athlete, I think, by all accounts, but you can take it what it is. That's where he ended up. He did get some offers and some interest late in the game when Louisville showed an interest in him, but he is now, at least at this point, I think, positioned. We'll see at spring game, the new starting tackle, and Kenny Thomas, who I think we all would consider to be a quality player, very big, very powerful guy who's got some experience, who will come in and is now the opposite end guard. And it's the battle continues at center with the 3 guys we talked about: Scheller, Haycraft, and Bell being the only one that was a recruited scholarship guy. So, I don't know what so far of the practice I've seen. The defensive front seems ahead of the offensive guys, in my opinion, because of Drew Bailey, James Hearns, Chris Williams. Those guys are tough. I mean, they seem better than, they have beaten some, Foy and some of those.
Trayvon Young being back.
And Trayvon Young is the other one, yeah. Chris Williams is really impressive. I think that guy's going to be good.
It's interesting you talk about Petrino's comments that he wants to basically play more physical football with the offense this year, and kind of makes you wonder if some of that is just geared towards toughening up the offensive line and making them approach this perhaps a little differently than they did last season, because it was pretty obvious, this wasn't, their identity was not to grind other teams down. I mean, they were going to outrun them. They weren't going to run through them.
Right. That's a good point.
And now maybe you want to try to develop an offensive line that's looking at it a little differently. Again, something to watch on Saturday to see if they're able to do that. I think having a new position coach for them, too, has probably been a very good thing, because everybody kind of gets to start over. He can take a fresh look on things and say, well, I think this will work to put him here, and I want to do this here. And where that does is that benefits a couple of non-scholarship guys. Mm-hmm. A guy who probably, if you had a previous coach, would have not really expected them to push for playing time. But when you have a brand new guy who's it's open for everybody, I say I do think it's a little bit of a red flag to have guys that inexperienced pushing for starting roles, but it's April. I mean, it's not August. If we're having this discussion a week before the first game, that's a lot different than having it right now. And who knows? They're going to get their chance on Saturday to really play well, and that's certainly something to keep an eye on.
Right. All right, so touch on the defense a little bit. You mentioned the calls. According by all accounts, it seems like they have really simplified the calls a lot. And it's almost crazy to think this is like was an issue. Going like 10 games into the year, they're having trouble getting the calls in. But I think if you look back to like the UK game, there were some guys looking over at the sideline. They hadn't got the call in. Grantham runs some very complex NFL-style schemes.
That is a observation that predates his time at Louisville.
Yeah, and I think against an up-tempo offense, that you haven't quite got it. I don't know. Maybe college guys just aren't always ready to grasp that, no matter how good you are. I don't know, but. Petrino had said, I don't know, he's only said it like once, so I don't know that was a huge deal, or maybe it was a one-off statement that he had, but he did say that a goal of his, he listed like two. Somebody asked him in pre-spring press conference, like, what are your goals? He was like, he mentioned being a power running team, getting that back to have Lamar be able to hand the ball off to the running back, take that pressure off Lamar that he has to make every decision, that he has to run every option, that he has to make every passing read.
But don't you want him doing that? He's the best player in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes down to it, we'll see whether that they end up doing that inevitably. But I'm just saying that was one of his stated goals for the spring. And the other one he said was to get a 4-man pass rush and not need to bring so many different blitzes. I wonder if they will, if maybe Sermon was brought in to be like, you know what, let's teach these guys we have a good, experienced defensive front. We have James Hearns as our edge rushing outside linebacker, 3 big experienced defensive linemen, and we have Trayvon Young, knock on wood, coming back. We should be able to get pressure with those guys. Just get them in position, get the call in. Don't have to make very many substitutions, and cater your defense to that. Now, I wonder if that's more or less kind of what their goal is this year, because if you watch them, they play a pretty simple, I would guess you'd call it like a 3-4, but it's sort of a nickel because one of their outside linebackers is essentially called the star. It's the same thing that we saw Harvey Clemens' position play. So it's basically the same kind of alignment that we saw when Grantham's defense ran a nickel. They have 3 big defensive linemen. Hearns stands up and is a rush outside linebacker. The opposite outside linebacker is called the star, and that's either been C.J. Avery, Kane Pass, and LaMarquez Thomas. So
C.J. Avery, I think, is going to be a very good football player.
Yeah, I mean, the guy was running with the first team on his first day of practice, essentially.
He looks the part.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens live. Let me ask Steve, name one guy on each side of the ball who you've seen very little of in games on Saturdays, or if at all, who you think could be a standout that you're looking forward to seeing on Saturday, that you haven't seen much in live game action?
Well, I mean, I'd be curious to see how Reggie does at running back. I mean, that'll be interesting to me. The older wide receivers, to see whether they do – the older wide receivers who haven't done much but are seemingly getting a bigger chance this time, like Bagley has had a good spring from the open practice. He made a ton of plays, and I mean, he's really barely played his first 3 years.
They've got some good receivers. I mean, they've got a good group of tall, rangy – good receiver.
Yeah, and
there's a lot of teams that would want these guys.
Yeah, and Jalen Smith isn't even playing. He's one of the 2 best. And Spence is another one, and Fitzpatrick. Those guys, just guys that we haven't seen in games yet, make plays to see whether they will. Now I feel like tight end is a little bit of an underappreciated position because I think Hicatini was so good, and I think it's going to be real hard for them to replace him. Now, they say that Crum and Stanberry are doing well. Fans who are seeing Jordan Davis for the first time in Texas A&M transfer will be impressed at how huge he is. He's enormous. I would think he would end up on the white team, on the second team, if they do that kind of format. But he is he'll be a guy that you'll see, and but he is apparently behind the other 2 guys as far as just kind of knowing everything that he's doing. Another guy on defense, they'll play. I think everybody has come to know that Stacey Thomas is their sort of stud inside linebacker, but the opposite linebacker, Amani Caban, is running with the 1 team there, and the defensive backfield's pretty much the same as what we've seen. Zach Cannon's been a starter, is always a pretty solid player. Chucky Williams, Jair Alexander, and True Washington are the starters there. So it's really experienced. as we'll mention very, very briefly here, they got a transfer last night from this guy, Boozy Whitlow, who was a defensive end, outside linebacker, rush-in kind of guy from South Carolina. I was thinking about this, and maybe it hadn't even, I knew it, but it was until I started counting them up. I'm like, man, they are going to lose a lot after this year on defense. A lot. Like, I do not know where it's all going to come from next year for them. I mean, this was a really key guy for them to get. He played a whole lot at South Carolina his first year. He was recruited by Lorenzo Ward, who's now the DB's coach at Louisville. He was the DC at South Carolina under Spurrier. Then they hired Muschamp, and Muschamp never played Whitlow at all. But he played a lot as a true freshman, then didn't play at all as a sophomore. So he wanted to transfer. And Louisville was his...
Muschamp let him go for his old DC?
What's that?
Muschamp let him go play for his old defense coordinator?
Oh, that's a good point. It's 2 years removed, though, I guess you would say.
Yeah, right. He didn't recruit him in South
Carolina. But that's true. And so, anyway, what I'm saying is that my larger point was to look ahead a year. And maybe if you're going out the spring game, appreciate the fact that the defense, even though they're losing, 4 really good players that all have a chance to get drafted, they have a really experienced group coming back on defense. They should be good. Again, they should be really good. But it is potential that they'll lose Hearns, Young, Williams, Richardson, Bailey, Thomas, Chucky Williams, Jair Alexander if he goes pro, and Tremaine Washington. And that only leaves like 2 or 3 guys that have never been starters before coming back. I mean, there will be nobody on the team next year who has started before this season on defense. So that's interesting to think about, and Whitlow obviously is a clear-cut guy. That's assuming Jair goes pro. I don't know that he will. He may not, but he'll have a chance. That's what I'm trying to say. So anyway, as you very quickly alluded to, we'll touch on it very quickly here, Gentry, or was sort of making unnamed allusion to. Shaq Wiggins left the team before spring practice, and Petrino lifted his restrictions that he had to Mississippi State. Shaq has not announced where he's going, or if that's
it would actually be pretty funny if he didn't go to Mississippi State, and he may not. I was reading buddy of mine, 24/7 Sports reported he visited Tennessee today. Actually, Shaq Wiggins did.
I mean,
I've been
Mississippi
Knoxville,
State,
I've been to Starkville, and I'm not so sure I'd pick Starkville.
I mean,
now.
if you got Tennessee, South Carolina, Mississippi State, I think that Mississippi State probably would be maybe the third most appealing, just as far as stature of the program.
Yeah, I mean, if he goes there, he's playing for his old coach, clearly. But I mean, Shaq didn't start last year, correct? I mean,
no. See, so this was one thing I want to bring up about Shaq, and I look back, I always really liked Shaq a lot. I thought he was great. You talked to him when you covered him back at Georgia. Very.
He's outgoing.
Affable.
Very quotable.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I always thought he was a really good cover corner. I thought he was a good, I'd see him in practice. He could cover staples. He could cover like a 6'4" guy. But he just didn't tackle all that much. And I think if you compare him to a guy like Alexander, who's really physical and really fast and really physical and can cover, but also can play the run and can also bump up a guy. I think that Shaq had been passed, and he was hurt a lot last year. So I think when people found out that he was transferring, they had viewed it as that it was a huge loss. It is a significant loss. I mean, he was a good player, experienced player, but I don't think he was in line to start. And
here's an interesting thing about Shaq is I think when he came to play for Grantham at Louisville, just like Josh Harvey Clemens did, there was kind of a false equivalency between the two. Shaq chose to leave Georgia. He was never kicked off the team there. True. He was never suspended. It had to do when Todd Grantham left, they hired Jeremy Pruitt as the new defensive coordinator at Georgia. Jeremy Pruitt is now at Alabama, actually. And the two of them, I think, didn't get along very well. And when Shaq left Georgia that spring and ended up at Louisville, it was fascinating because the statement he released was actually to the site I worked for at the time. He sent us the statement, and we ran it. And it was basically in so many words, I have to have fun on the football field, and I'm not having any fun playing for this guy.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a very honest statement, basically. I mean, it's basically from a guy who kind of wanted to joke around a little bit and a coach who wasn't having it. And not a lot of coaches, I mean, that's not the kind of thing, if you're a coach, you want to read. Probably. Yeah. I mean, I think Todd Grantham is the exception here because I think he likes Shaq and kind of knows how to handle a guy like that. But it'll be interesting to see where he lands and to see where he's going to play. I mean, now you're talking about a guy who's transferred twice of his own accord in both cases. And, I hope it works out for him because I always like Shaq, but I think he's going to have to find the right situation for him. And if there was some question that Louisville was the right situation with Todd Grantham here, not sure why you would think Mississippi State would be.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess because Grantham's there.
Terrell Buckley.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I always had sort of heard or viewed that Shaq was probably going to leave. He didn't announce it till March, which surprised me. I thought he would probably announce it earlier. Maybe he hadn't made up his mind, but that just always is where I had heard he was leaning was leaving, because he did graduate. That's the difference. That he's eligible next season. And the one other thing with Shaq is, like I said, I mean, he's a good cover corner. If he can go a place, it'll put him out, let him play press man, let him cover a guy man to man. That's fine. If they are asking for a lot more of him as a tackler and things like that, and especially given his injury history, I'm not sure that he does that well. So he'll need to find a good spot. But he's an experienced guy, and as we've seen, fifth-year experienced grad transfers can end up playing for really good teams. So anyway, Gentry, I appreciate. We'll probably leave it there. Gentry, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Welcome to your CardsHQ premiere.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun. Knocked off the podcast rust there.
Right. All right. Well, thanks again also to Jeff for coming on earlier to talk about the basketball news. Be sure to like our subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. It's the best way to get it, and search for it on there. Gentry, I don't know. Is it on Stitcher and the Android and all those other?
Anywhere you could find it. And please give a rating, especially if you like the podcast, you want other people to find it. It's one of the best things you can do is give us a high rating. Jeff and Steve do a good job on here, so hopefully, tell your friends.
Yeah, exactly. 5-star rating, or else you're not allowed to rate it. So
yeah, right.
And also like CardsHQ on our Facebook page and all the stuff on Courier-Journal.com. So thanks very much for listening in, and keep reading the newspaper and the website. Thanks very much.